All right, greetings to our member schools and also prospective schools. I wanted to take the time to share with you some updates of what we have been working on behind the scenes here at Golden State Association of Christian Schools. We have been in a 2-year process of working with WASC, which is the Western Association of Schools and Colleges, to come up with an agreement that would essentially put GSACS at the table with the accreditation process with our member schools. And Dr. Walton from the American Association of Christian Schools has been working with me, and I have asked him to join me today to be able to explain a little bit more in detail what has been going on behind the scenes and what we have been able to agree upon with WASC when it comes to the accreditation process. I'm excited about this, very excited. I think that this will help our schools immensely, at least, or I should say at the very least, it will give them options. So when we first started this agreement, or this conversation, I should say, we were just hoping to at least be able to sit at the table, as it were, anytime that WASC was accrediting one of our member schools. I think it's really important that we have a Christian voice at that table when when our schools are seeking accreditation. We were hoping at a greater point to have what we would call a memo of understanding with WASC that would actually be a collaboration with the American Association of Christian Schools and with the Western Association of Schools and Colleges. In essence, we did get both, maybe not as seamless as we had hoped, and we'll explain that process with you. But I am excited that we were able to work out an agreement, a collaboration, a partnership, however you want to call it. And so we want to explain some of that with you today. Dr. Jeff Walton is the Executive Director of the American Association of Christian Schools. And I have a series of questions that I would like to ask him, and we're just going to have a conversation here to help you better understand the process. So, Dr. Walton, if we could at least start the conversation by having you comment on AACS accreditation, the state recognitions, and really kind of the world of regional accreditation.
So that is a complex and changing world. As you and I have discussed several times in this process of working out an MOU with WASC, it has changed a lot in the last 20 years. It's changed very rapidly in the last 5 years, and it's changing today. So, some of what I would say in this introduction about the world of K-12 accreditation for private schools might not even be accurate 6 months from now. It's that fast. Our Mid-South Association Director, Matt Tiskus, was just in a meeting on Wednesday. We're recording this on a Friday. So just two days ago, he was in a meeting in Texas where some of the agencies like AACS that accredit private schools in Texas announced some changes to their protocols that are really, really significant. And the indication from that meeting is that this is the direction that everybody is going. So even 6 months from now, things might look a little different than they do today. In January, I'll be at a meeting with NCPSA, the National Council for Private School Accreditation. And I think at that meeting, I'll get a little better sense of whether or not this new direction or new trend is going to be recognized nationwide by agencies. But I really think that it will be. And so, things keep changing, and it won't be bad. So for Christian schools, for private schools, I think it will put even more options on the table. So if you would look at the world of K-12 accreditation 25 years ago, you would find a process that was very challenging for small Christian schools. The expectations of accrediting agencies were very rigorous. And they didn't always make sense for small schools. So a couple of quick illustrations. I have the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools standards from 1996. So about 25 years ago. Those standards, which would have somewhat been the gold standard at that time, required that an accredited school have a full-time librarian with a degree in library science. They required that an accredited school have a full-time maintenance person on the school campus during the school day. So, even those two things would mean that, most private schools couldn't check those boxes. And then it was very much a checklist. So if you couldn't check all the boxes, then you weren't going to be able to be an accredited school. It's very, very different today. There's very much more of a school improvement approach. And there's also very much more an evaluation of a school in its circumstances. So what's the size of your school? What's the mission of your school? And so a lot of things are considered in accreditation processes today that were not considered 25 years ago. For AACS, this is an area where interest has expanded exponentially in the 14 years since I started with AACS. And I would say today, exponential might even be not even be a strong enough term. I was just looking at some data with our staff yesterday because they're frustratingly behind in processing teacher certification applications. And so they came to me with some information and said, Jeff, we're up 30% from last year.
Wow.
So just in 1 year, and certification applications are an indicator of how many schools are engaged in pursuing the accreditation process. Our accreditation applications have increased by similar numbers year over year for a long time. And so there's kind of an exploding interest in accreditation. And as school leaders, you probably understand some of the reasons for that. One of the reasons for that is that the models have changed so that Christian schools feel like they can participate in a process that 25 years ago, they would have been very uncomfortable participating in. Right. And so that change from what was called a compliance model to a school improvement model has been a good thing for Christian schools. In accreditation, there are still some compliance elements. So there are basic thresholds that you have to meet if you're going to become an accredited school. But those bars aren't as high as they were in the past, and schools have opportunities to make progress toward accreditation standards in ways that are different than they were before. So that's a little bit of an overview. Just a couple of comments about the AACS process. Accreditation is still very much a state-by-state process. And so what's needed for recognition in a state or what's needed for partnerships in a state varies from state to state. Our accreditation process is directly recognized by whatever the recognizing agency is in 23 states. And we do that at the request of our state affiliate and with the support of our state affiliate. But in some states, there is no mechanism for what's called a national accrediting agency, which would be AACS. There is no mechanism for a national accrediting agency to be approved. And instead, it makes more sense for schools to work through a memo of understanding or a cooperative agreement with an organization like WASC. We typically don't have any problem getting through those agreements or those recognition processes because we have established ourselves so well in multiple states. In fact, we were just asked to go through the process with a state in the Midwest, and they just asked us to submit what we had already submitted to another state in the Midwest and said, listen, if they recognized you, we'll recognize you. And so we see many things like that. One other comment on that, and that's that We are an agency approved by the U.S. Department of Education for the Student Exchange Visitor Program. There is only one federal program where the U.S. government has any authority to recognize private school accrediting agencies, and that's in the Student Exchange Visitor Program. We're a recognized accrediting agency for that program. And so that gives us some status also. You had mentioned something about regionals, so just a quick word about regionals like WASC. AACS has in place a direct relationship with one of the regionals, that's Cognia. We have in place a bridge to relationships for dual accreditation or co-accreditation with Middle States and Cognia through a third party called NACSA, North American Christian School Accrediting Agency. So all these have been put in place in response to the needs that schools have. So schools in a particular state or a particular region have talked to their state office. They've said, hey, we need this. It would help us. And so we've put those relationships in place in a similar way to what we've done in partnership with you. I did want to mention one other thing about regionals. So, regional accreditation, most of our schools would have been very wary of 25 years ago, would not have felt that they had a need for it. But a lot of that has changed also. And so we developed the bridges to regionals like WASC, but something that school leaders might find useful to know if they don't already. Prior to 2010, the 6 regionals acted within regional boundaries and respected those regional boundaries. So WASC did not accredit schools outside the region that was WASC. Southern Association did not accredit schools outside that region. In 2010, the Southern Association and the North Central Association combined and became a new organization called Advance Ed. And Advance Ed put all of the other regionals on notice that in the K-12 accreditation world, they were no longer going to stay within their regional boundaries. So they would go outside, they would accredit schools wherever those schools wanted their recognition. Since that time, they've also encompassed the Northwest region in their group. So I think that's 37 states altogether that fall within that. We still have the New England Association that's independent of them. We still have the Mid-America Association. I'm getting Mid-Atlantic, I'm sorry, MSA. Mid-Atlantic Schools Association that's independent from them, and WASC that has a relationship with them but is independent from them. And that group that was Advanced Ed is now Cognia. So that was a name change about 3 years ago. And so for school leaders, regional accreditation is no longer regional in the old sense. Any one of the regionals will go anywhere and accredit a school. And so that's been a pretty significant change also.
One thing before we head on to some of the other questions, I was in Washington, D.C. at the AACS Legislative Conference just last week, and I heard a lot of great news about the movement of school choice happening throughout the states. How does that change that great progress that we're seeing with school choice? I know it doesn't necessarily affect accreditation, but if California were ever to see school choice, how important does accreditation become at that point?
So that will depend on the form that school choice takes in your state. But school choice almost always comes with some kind of an accountability mechanism. Ideally, it wouldn't. We would, parents would be the accountability mechanism. Parents would make the best educational choices for their kids. And the newest form of school choice, education savings accounts, really does let parents make those choices. And so we're very supportive of ESAs and all the doors that opens, not just for Christian school families, but for homeschool families, It does a lot of really, really great things. But in multiple states where school choice is either a voucher program or a tax credit scholarship program, or in some of the states where it's an ESA program, the state puts an accountability mechanism in place related to the schools that students who receive those funds might attend. And quite often that's accreditation. So it's accreditation either by one of the regional bodies or by another agency approved by whatever their process is. So some illustrations of that in Alabama, Indiana, Wisconsin, Florida. To participate in their school choice programs, the student has to be a student at an accredited school, and the accrediting agency has to be recognized by the state for that purpose. In all of those states, we are a recognized agency for those purposes, but that becomes schools that, for instance, in California today that would pursue accreditation by WASC or now by AACS through our cooperative agreement with WASC, one of the things they'd be doing would be positioning themselves in a better place to take advantage of school choice programs when those programs become available in California. Notice I said when. Let's hope that's accurate. So
I'm praying. You mentioned earlier a memo of understanding. Could you tell us exactly what that is?
Yeah, so not all of our agreements with other agencies take that form, but usually that's the form that they take. So a memo of understanding is an agreement between organizations, in this case, accrediting agencies, where they say, we will recognize your process as substantially equivalent to our process, and therefore a school that is accredited under your protocols and processes will also be accredited under our protocols and processes. Again, if you go back 25 years, if you wanted to be accredited by more than one agency, you would have to go through all of the processes for every one of those agencies and host separate teams for every one of those agencies. And there were schools that did that. There were schools that had 3, 4, 5 accreditations and hosted teams all the time. But today, there instead are MOUs between organizations, and that generally means one set of protocols. The agencies agree to respect or accept the protocols from the other agency. It generally means one visiting team and one report, and it allows the school to have accreditation by sometimes multiple agencies, but with only one team visit and one self-study process.
So what is the benefit for a school to have accreditation from multiple agencies?
Again, that's going to depend on where you are. So, for instance, in Indiana, where AACS is one of the, I think, 9 agencies now that are recognized as accrediting agencies for the Indiana School Choice Program, very few of our schools have multiple accreditations because they don't need it. We're recognized for everything that they would need to be recognized for college acceptance, for enrollment in or enrolling choice students. So Indiana is a good illustration of that. Texas is another good illustration of that. But in other states where there may not be a mechanism for the agency to be recognized for college admissions, for instance, or for a school choice program, then a co-accreditation, usually with a regional, has benefits for that school. For a lot of schools, the benefit is really just public relations. We're accredited by this Christian school accrediting agency, and also to show that that's credible, we have accreditation by this regional accrediting agency.
Okay. We, in our MOU with WASC, I think we kind of worked through 3 different options, or it accommodates 3 different options. Each one has different timelines. There's a lot of differences between agencies with timelines and processes. But I think it would be good for us to lay out those three options right now, and then to just kind of walk through the pros and cons and the differences between the options. The first one is that if a school pursued AACS alone, and then after they received accreditation status from AACS, they could then have the choice of applying to WASC for a second accreditation status, kind of as two different steps. The second option would be vice versa. If they are already WASC accredited or pursue WASC solely, they could then after that pursue AACS and apply for AACS status. And the third option would be if they wanted to actually apply at both agencies and gain accreditation status in one step, or I should say in one process there. Those are the three options that our MOU accommodated. Let's go ahead, and maybe it would be best if we walked through how AACS accreditation and WASC accreditation, how the processes are slightly different. I don't know if it would be best to go through each option one at a time or talk about the big differences and then talk about how they affect each option. Any thoughts?
So I'm going to start a little further back than that, and then we'll talk about some of the ways that the processes are different. And then I think we could walk pretty quickly through each of the three options so schools would understand how they can do that. To go back a little bit further, our memo of understanding with other regionals is simpler. And Shannon and I have talked about this multiple times. Cognia or Middle States in their co-accreditation agreement with AACS and other agencies basically just say, you recognize our process. Everybody does what's called a crosswalk. So they take the protocols and the expectations of the other agency and they match them up with theirs and say, do they match up well enough for us to say, yes, this is the language and accreditation is substantially equivalent. So it might not be identical, but it's substantially asking for the same things. And once that crosswalk is completed and both agencies say, yes, we have substantially equivalent processes, then they just recognize the visiting team, the report, everything from the other agency. Middle States requires about a 2-page addendum to the report from AACS. Cognia actually requires nothing. No additional addendum, no additional report. WASC is a little bit different.
In other words, if a school were to get accredited by AACS in the Cognia region, they could then just apply at Cognia, and AACS literally sends the reports to Cognia and they automatically accept. Exactly.
It's as simple as that. So we were hoping for something similar with WASC. But WASC works differently, and they're, I'm sure they have good reasons for that. All of their agreements with agencies like AACS are collaborative agreements rather than the straight recognition agreements. Shannon and I had a meeting with the ACSI representative in California. Actually, I don't remember. Were you part of that meeting, Shannon? Or?
I was away at that time.
Okay. But I'm trying to remember who was in that then. I think it was Ed Francis and I, and maybe one of our other commissioners who were part of that meeting. And that the MOU that AACS has with WASC is identical or nearly identical to the MOU that ACSI has. So it's not that, AACS didn't get as good a deal as somebody else gets with WASC. It's just that these are the expectations for WASC. They want collaborative agreements rather than direct recognition agreements. So in that, here's some of the differences between what WASC expects in their process and the AACS does, and then those will affect how schools go through this process. WASC does something that no other accrediting agency does, or I should say did, because as of 2 days ago, this might be different. So this is one of the changes that I think might be coming down the pike for everybody. WASC does an initial visit at a school. That's usually a one-day visit with just one or two people, and they evaluate whether that school is meeting their core standards, their basic expectations. So health and safety expectations, prepared faculty expectations, organized curriculum expectations. So they look at some of the basic pieces, and they will initially approve a school for accreditation at that point for up to a 3-year period. That nobody else in the K-12 world does that. Although that is one of the things that I think will be changing in the next year or two with a number of organizations. But that's a difference. AACS and other accrediting agencies, instead of that visit, do what's called a consultative visit, where a consultant is sent to the campus for one day. The consultant evaluates the school for the same basic expectations of quality that are expected for an accredited school. And then that consultant advises the school on what they need to do to start their self-study process. And the school then has candidate status, but it doesn't not have official accredited status. So there's a pretty significant difference. In the WASC process, at that visit, a school can get accredited status. In the WASC process, then they have 3 years to complete their self-study and prepare for a team visit. The AACS process, they have up to 2 years, although most schools take about 1 year to complete their self-study and prepare for a visit. During that year, or during that period of time, in the WASC process, they are an accredited school. In the AACS process, they are not yet an accredited school. They have candidate status. And that makes very little difference except in school choice states. And I think this is why that might be something that changes, because it would allow a school in a school choice state to have the status that they need for participation in those programs. So there's that difference. Then for both agencies, there's a self-study process. WASC protocols for the self-study process and the AACS protocols are substantially equivalent, but they're not the same. And one of the really significant differences for Christian schools is WASC has DEI standards, AACS does not. So diversity, equity, and inclusion standards have become really significant concerns for schools. I think that your WASC accredited schools right now are comfortable with the way WASC handles those for Christian schools. And we made assure in our meetings that we were comfortable with the way WASC was handling those. We see very similar things with Cognia and Middle States. So all of the regionals now have DEI standards that are a part of what they expect, but they all allow religious schools and religious accreditors to interpret those in light of their religious mission or Christian mission. And so we don't feel at this time like there's a risk to Christian schools who are accredited under our standards that they would have to give up their biblical position on marriage and human sexuality or something like that. But that is a difference in the standards. Then continuing down the road, there is a team visit. That's the same for both. Then there's a period of accreditation. That's 6 years for WASC. AACS, it's either 5 or 7 years. In California, in order to be consistent with things, I think we're going to have to do a 6-year period for all schools so that we don't make things just really confusing, which would be something we would want to avoid.
Thank you.
And for WASC, in the middle of that 6-year period, there's a mid-consult or a midterm visit. So right now, I think some of those are virtual instead of on campus, but there's a midterm visit that happens. And then in the last year, essentially, of your cycle, you prepare for a new team visit and you start the cycle again. I did omit one thing that's significantly different between them. In the WASC process, after you have your initial visit and you get initial accredited status, you have to complete what for them is called a school-wide action plan. That has to be done immediately after that visit. And that school-wide action plan is, how are we going to improve as a school and prepare to meet the expectations for accreditation. The AACS process, that similar document was called a school improvement plan, and it happens after your team visit. The reasoning of our commission was, why should you prepare a plan for school improvement before the team's been there and helped what it is that you should try to improve? So those are some of the differences, and then those play into the three scenarios that we talked about. Are you ready to jump into those, or do you have a follow-up?
No, this is great. Let's talk about pursuing AACS accreditation solely first, that option.
So if you pursued AACS accreditation, you would have a one-day consultative visit. You'd use AACS standards and protocols. You would conduct your self-study. So self-study is not a document to complete. It's a process to complete. You evaluate yourself as a school. How do we measure up to the 12 standards and all the indicators that are indicators of what quality schools do under the AACS protocol? So you study yourself, you collect data and information, and then you write a report on that. Most schools take about a year to do that. Some take longer than that. Some stretch it out to 2 or 3 years. Very, very few compress it to less than that. If you pursue accreditation for any reason other than school improvement, you're pursuing it for the wrong reason. Now, I know that might be kind of a hard statement to make, because there are a lot of other reasons why schools, parents expect it. Colleges in some cases there are a lot of other reasons why schools want to do it. But I have been involved in the accreditation process with somewhere north of 200 schools now. And I can tell you from experience, if the school approaches it as a way to become a better school, this is how we evaluate ourselves. This is how we look at whether or not we're meeting the expectations for quality that are commonly accepted. And then how do we become a better school? If the school approaches it that way, it really works. They become a better school. If they approach it instead as, and we got to get this done because we got to get into our school choice program, and that's only 6 months away, and they might get it done, but they're not going to realize the value from it that they should. In fact, we've got 2 schools in school choice states that went through the process that way. We got to get it done. We got to get it approved. That will close this year. Because even though they did accreditation, and even though they put themselves in a place where they could accept the vouchers or the scholarships in their state, they didn't become a better school through the process. And so, they're closing this year. They didn't even survive with the possibility of bringing in scholarship students and school choice students. So backing up, sorry, I got a little off track there, which I am inclined to do. But so if you do AACS, you do the consultative visit, you do your self-study process, you host a team visit, the team makes a recommendation for or against accreditation, and we have never had a team make a recommendation against accreditation. And part of that is because we do a really thorough job with the consultative visit and the preparations for a school. We don't want you to pay $3,000 worth of expenses to bring a team into your campus and house them and feed them and take care of everything, and then have them give you a negative recommendation. But not all agencies treat it that way. And so, I think that's actually an advantage of our program, is we try to be more developmental in helping you make sure that you're not going to bring a team in and have an unsuccessful visit. The team makes a recommendation to our commissioners. The commissioners make the final decision about whether or not the school is recognized. If you did that, and you then are AACS accredited, and you want to be accredited by WASC, then we would communicate with WASC. We would submit your documentation to the school. And the MOU is a little bit unclear about this, but what it appears would happen is that WASC would send someone to your school for a one-day visit. They would confirm that the school is meeting WASC expectations, and then they would grant WASC accreditation. They would require a mid-term visit for WASC, and that would be done collaboratively. This is one of the places where, Shannon was really wanting to make sure that GSACS was at the table when anything happened. And so everything that happens that is both WASC and AACS, there will be a WASC or an AACS representative there. You'd complete your cycle. And then when you were ready for reaccreditation, then you would still complete it under AACS protocols, the AACS self-study. Your visiting team would be a collaborative team. So what we think that's going to mean at most schools is one WASC appointed representative on your team. It might be two. A team is typically 5 or 6 people. 5 is more the norm. And one of those would be a WASC appointed person. So if AACS is the lead and you go through it that way, then your team is going to be primarily AACS people. There's a lot more AACS control with it. Any questions about that one, Shannon, or should we launch into the next one?
No, let's go ahead and launch into the other one. What's nice about this agreement is I could actually stand in as a WASC representative with my ear to the AACS team, and that's just another benefit through this MOU that we have that I'm excited about. The second option would be they are already WASC accredited and want to pursue AACS.
Yeah, so and backing up a little bit to you serving as the WASC representative on the team, there would be other GSACS school leaders and people who would be able to do that. And that's one of the things that happens with these collaborative relationships that we have with Middle States or with Cognia. Middle States requires that someone on every reaccreditation team be a Middle States trained representative. But we have, I think, almost 40 AACS people who are now Middle States trained representatives. So I can't recall a time in the last 10 years where the Middle States representative on an AACS team was not also an AACS person. And so that's one of the things that we're working toward in this collaborative relationship with WASC. And I will be very, very surprised if we're not in a really good place for that very quickly there in California. So the other scenario would be if a school is already WASC accredited and then wants to pursue co-accreditation with AACS. You would just communicate with Shannon and then through her with us that was your intent. And AACS would recognize your WASC accreditation. So we would not even require someone on your campus for a one-day visit. We would recognize your WASC accreditation, grant AACS accreditation for the remainder of your term. And then at your reaccreditation, you can either stay under WASC protocols or make the switch over to AACS protocols. You'd have to communicate with everybody about that ahead of time, but that would be an option for you. If you stayed under WASC protocols, then WASC would put your team together, but your team would have at least one AACS representative on it. And so on that side, a little bit simpler, and we would not require the one-day confirmation visit. We just recognize your WASC accreditation, and then we'd be part of a collaborative team visit after that. On that team visit, with your self-study and with your team visit, there is an addendum from each agency. So if you're doing a WASC process, there's an AACS addendum, and it's really just the things that are Christian school distinctives. So your WASC doesn't have those as part of their protocols. And so it's probably a page of affirmations about Christian school distinctives that you make. And then your AACS team representative would complete a short addendum also to that report. That happens on the other side too. There's some WASC affirmations and a WASC addendum to the report.
Okay. And then the third option, we've probably answered a lot of those questions as we've talked about the differences between the two. But if a school wanted to do the joint accreditation process, what would be the first step?
Yeah, so this is a scenario that was in mind when the MOU was created. But the reality is, I don't think very many schools will do it this way. But if you're a school that is not currently accredited by either AACS or WASC, and you say, hey, I want to start this process from scratch, and I want to do a collaborative AACS and WASC process, you would start by notifying the agency whose protocols you want to use. So you would notify either WASC or AACS, say, hey, I want to start accreditation, I want to use your protocols or the other. That agency then would communicate with the other. So if you communicate with us, we'll communicate with WASC and say, this is a school that wants to do both. What would happen then in that process is you would have that initial visit for accreditation. That would be a collaborative visit. It's probably just two people, a WASC person and an AACS person for one day. For WASC, they're establishing that you meet their expectations for initial accreditation. For AACS, we would be establishing that you meet the expectations for candidacy. And then you would do so if it's WASC, you're initially accredited. I believe that they're gonna, that's a little bit unclear in the MOU, Shannon, but I believe that they would recognize that as initial accreditation. It's candidacy status for AACS. You do your self-study process under whichever set of protocols you choose. And then after your self-study process, then you host a team. It's going to be a collaborative AACS and WASC team. Then you get a 6-year accreditation period. In the middle of that, you have that midterm visit, maybe virtual, maybe on campus. That's going to be collaborative, an AACS representative and a WASC representative. And then in year 5, then you start your self-study process again so that you can host a team before the end of year 6.
Okay. And depending on which protocol you choose is probably how the decision would be made as to who chairs the team during a visit.
Correct. So, and in fact, that is noted in the MOU. So if you're using AACS protocols, it's going to be an AACS chair. That chair has the responsibility for communicating with both agencies and with the schools. And you know, very frankly, that's one of the reasons that I think Christian schools should very seriously think about doing a collaborative process using the Christian school protocols, because your chair is very significant to what the team expects of you, and as you know, concerns about DEI standards and other things increase. By selecting the Christian school protocols, you're putting yourself in a better place. You're using their protocols. The Christian organization is selecting the chair for your team. Several things that could be really significant at the time of the team visit. Although, in all fairness, you know, there have not been issues that way with WASC. In a couple of other regions, there have been. We've had some Christian schools doing a regional accreditation who've ended up with a chair that did not have a good understanding or very much sympathy for the Christian school position on some really important issues. But I'm not aware of any issue like that to date that has happened with WASC.
And we do have a couple of GSACS member schools who have chaired WASC teams before. So that's always a possibility too, that we would have a GSACS member who is qualified to act as a chair for WASC, if ever, you know, again, depending on protocols. You've used the word, when I've heard you discuss our agreement, you've used the word insulator before, how this agreement really does become an insulation, as it were, for schools. Can you share a little bit of your reason behind that?
Yeah, and I think that I probably used that word just last week in a board of directors meeting when we talked about the relationship with Cognia. one of the reasons that AACS has pursued the either collaborative or cooperative relationships with regional accreditors is because we have member schools who are interested in having recognition by a regional for a number of reasons. But for those schools, there's some level of risk because, as already discussed, those regional accreditors do have DEI standards and may assign team members or team chairs for a review that don't really understand the Christian school or the biblical positions on issues like that. And I think we're getting out ahead of that problem. So especially here with WASC, we're trying to get out ahead of that problem. And so if you are using AACS protocols and AACS is assigning your team, and the WASC role in it is just collaborating on the team, then I think you put something in between your school and the possibility of those issues with the regional accreditor. So we've very actively pursued these in the last couple of years, and entirely with the purpose of being an insulator for our schools, providing for them a pathway to the regional accreditation that they want, with a less direct relationship with the regional that we believe does and will insulate them from what might become the expectations.
That sounds great. Before we move on to, I just have a few more questions here. What's the price point difference between the two agencies that we're talking about here, WASC and AACS?
Do you know what WASC annual dues are, Shannon?
I want to say they're $1,200.
And I think that's correct. So WASC dues, I think, are $1,200 a year. The Cognia dues are $1,200 a year. That's pretty standard for the regional accreditors. AACS fees for accreditation are right now $160 a year. So if you were doing AACS accreditation, you would pay an annual fee of $160 a year. If you co-accredit with WASC, you're still going to pay them $1,200 a year. So whether they're your lead agency or the secondary agency, your fees to them are going to be $1,200 a year. Your fee to AACS is going to be $150 a year. Apart from that, I think that fees or costs are going to be very similar. The difference that shows up is probably going to be on the team visit. So if you are hosting a WASC team visit, you're going to pay travel expenses for your team coming in. You're going to pay hotel and meals and other expenses, but you're not going to pay any kind of stipend to team members. In the AACS process, you pay the travel expenses and the hotels, but you also pay a stipend of $75 a day to each of your team members. That usually amounts to about $1,000. It's not really significant, but we think that it says something. It's not enough to be a pay to a team member, but it is enough to say, we're grateful for the time you took away from your school and your responsibilities to invest in the success of our school and our accreditation process. So it's probably, that's going to be the most significant difference in costs, is every 6 years when you host your team, if you're under AACS protocols, you're going to pay a stipend to each team member.
Yes, and the difference in price for just the annual fees is a recognition of the value of the membership, of being a part of GSACS and therefore AACS. It's a huge benefit when you think about that yearly annual fee. So thank you.
Yeah, regional accreditors like WASC, they're just accreditors. That's the only thing that they do. And so if they're going to pay their bills, they're going to collect pretty significant annual fees from schools in order to do that. Organizations like GSACS and AACS, we're membership organizations, and accreditation is one of the services that's offered to a school through membership. So schools are paying dues to GSACS. A portion of that gets passed through to AACS, and part of our really low annual accreditation fees are recognition that schools are already paying dues to our organizations.
Excellent. We know that every ministry, school, not everyone needs accreditation. When should a school start to consider accreditation? Is it about size, funding? I know we've already talked about school improvement as being the motive for it, but when would you say a school would be ready?
So I thought about that. I would say every school should think about it and start positioning themselves for it.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah, I mean, you should. AACS standards for accreditation are on our website. You can go to our website under the services tab, pull up the standards for accreditation and say, what would be expected of an accredited school? Because the standards and indicators for accreditation are the measures of what quality schools do. So there's no school that I've ever visited that does every indicator at a high level. That's not what they're saying. But they are saying, in the area of student safety, one of our standards, these are the things that quality schools do to ensure student safety. And so the standards and the indicators are a good measuring rod for you to say, how well do I stack up to what other quality schools are doing? I tell people that are interested in starting schools, people that contact us about starting a school, one of the resources I point them to is accreditation standards. So if you want to start a school, you want to start a good school, you want to run a good school. And here are the things that quality schools do. And so if you want to start on the right path, then look at what quality schools do and start working toward every one of those things. Every school, I think, should consider that. Is it about size? No, not really. There are some accrediting agencies that have a minimum size. They won't accredit a school below a certain number because they don't believe schools below that size can put together enough pieces to be a quality school. But neither WASC nor AACS has a minimum size. When we were in one of our meetings with Dr. George from WASC, she was talking about doing a visit at I think it was just like a K1 and 2, a very small school that had only a handful of students at it. It was a startup, and they wanted to get started in the right way. So there's not a minimum size. Smaller schools do struggle more with the process. So they don't have as many people to divide the responsibilities among. They don't have as many people to engage on their self-study teams and doing the work. But they also have, fewer things to look at than a larger school. So it's a little bit of a trade-off. We've had schools, I think the smallest school that has successfully done the AACS process was a K-3. So it wasn't a K-12 school, but was a K-3 with about 20 students. They took about 3 years to work through what they needed to do. We've had K-12 schools with as few as 40 students that have worked through the process. So it's not really about size, not really about years of existence. I think, pursuing it from the beginning is a good thing. And it should not necessarily be about school choice. But every school today, school choice is a wave, and it's getting some hard pushback. But it has expanded incredibly in the last 2 years. There are now, I think, 9 states that have ESA programs that will apply to every student in the state, essentially. And so, we can pray that spreads from state to state, but many states, if they do that, are going to require accreditation as a part of it. And so I think every school should be really looking at putting the pieces in place so that they'd be able to do the process.
And it's not about curriculum or the method of teaching either. So you've accredited ACE schools, you've accredited your traditional, you've accredited video schools. Am I correct in that?
So mostly they're traditional schools, and they're traditional schools using, traditional curriculum. But years ago, when we had the first ACE school contact us about wanting to be an accredited school, I met with some leaders at NCPSA, National Council for Private School Accreditation, and I said, this would be new for us. Is anybody doing this? And the answer then was, well, no, nobody really is, but we think somebody should. So an ACE school and a video school would fall in the same category. And so if you're watching this and you're one of those schools, you're an ACE or you're a video school, it's a tough hill for most of those schools, but it is something they can do. We have currently 3 video or ACE accredited schools. Okay. Shannon, I'm going to pause this for just a second. Sorry. So for an ACE school or a video school, they do have to meet all of the standards that other schools meet. And that's usually, something of a hurdle for them. So when we first talk to a school about that, we'll say, you have to produce curriculum guides for your program. And they'll say, well, why do we have to produce curriculum guides? We use a self-paced, individual student curriculum. And well, it's one of the expectations that your teachers have thoughtfully considered what it is that you're teaching and where you're teaching that as students progress through your program. And we have ACE schools and a Becca Video School who have done that. They've worked through that. They have completed that process, and they're better schools for that. Before they started that process, they didn't see the value of that. But after having done that, then they feel like their teachers are better prepared to help students as they work through that. One of the other things that tends to be a barrier for ACE and video schools is we do require that they use degreed teachers in teacher roles and in reasonable ratios with student counts. So taking it, for example, an ACE program, you might have a learning center for your 1st through 3rd grade that has 22 kids in it. We would expect that the supervisor of that learning center be a degreed teacher. Now, there may be aides, just like there could be classroom aides, and those aides would not have to be degreed teachers, but the supervisor of that learning center would have to be. And that has to be in reasonable numbers. So you couldn't pack, all 93 kids in one learning center, provide one degreed teacher and a bunch of assistants with that. So the ACE schools that have worked through the accreditation process, they found it challenging, but they have gotten it done, and they feel like they're better schools for that, and have improved their programs with that.
That's great to hear. One question, not really at all related to WASC and this agreement, is that we have several prospective schools, schools that are looking into joining GSACS and therefore AACS, but they are ACSI accredited. If they wanted to switch membership and go through the process of moving from ACSI accreditation to AACS accreditation, what does that process look like? What would be the steps for doing that?
So ACSI is an accreditation process that is substantially equivalent to the AACS process. We do not have an agreement for recognition with ACSI, but AACS recognizes the quality of the AACS process. So we have had schools transfer their membership and their accreditation. Now we've had it happen the other way too, and I don't know what happens the other direction. But coming this direction, we recognize an AACS accreditation, an ACSI accreditation as substantially equivalent for AACS accreditation for the duration of their accreditation. So let's say an ACSI school transfers membership and accreditation, we'll accept their ACSI accreditation, and we will issue an AACS accreditation certificate. If the duration, and then they have to prepare for an AACS team. If the duration of their ACSI accreditation is more than 2 years, then they have to have an interim on-site visit. So we'd send a small team for a one-day visit to affirm that they're still meeting the expectations for accreditation that they were meeting at the time of the ACSI visit. If it's less than 2 years, we don't have to do that affirmation visit. But if it's more than 2 years, we want to make sure that they didn't stop doing everything that they said they were doing or told ACSI that they would do. Our MOU with WASC does not cover this. So if they were, I'm pretty sure if they were ACSI and WASC accredited, that WASC would just continue their recognition based on the ACSI visit and now their collaborative agreement with us. But that is something that we would want to talk with WASC about before that happened, to make sure that the school didn't have some kind of a lapse in their accreditation coverage because of a transfer like that.
So then in their next school visit, they would be switching over to AACS protocols.
Correct. So they'd be switching over to AACS protocols, would be an AACS team. One other thing that would be significant for schools there, AACS and ACSI both have teacher certification as a part of our processes. You can, in the AACS process now, achieve an initial or a standard 5-year accreditation with degreed teachers instead of certified teachers. But schools that are working toward higher levels of recognition, for instance, we have a new level called accredited with merit that comes with a 7-year term. Then teacher certification is expected. Ideally, all schools work that way and put in place credentialed people. But if a school is transferring from ACSI, we recognize ACSI teacher certificates until their expiration, at which time a teacher would have to renew with an AACS certificate.
Okay. This has been very helpful. If a school is interested in actually seeking AACS accreditation, can you just give very quickly here just some steps for how they would go through that process?
Yeah, so the first step, if you're interested in AACS accreditation, is to purchase an AACS accreditation manual. It's available in the bookstore on our website. Can't remember if it's $60 or $75. I think it's $75 now. The reason for asking that is the purchase of a manual is what triggers everything in our processes. We have lots of schools that inquire about accreditation. We have lots of schools that call our office and say, hey, we're interested in accreditation. Can you, in a 5-minute phone call, tell me what I need to do? So we have lots of schools that express an interest in accreditation that never go further than expressing that interest. And so when a school purchases a manual, to us, that's saying, hey, they're serious enough to spend $75 to show that they're really going to get engaged in the process. And then they go into our record keeping. If we send information out to prospective schools, they get included in that. But for us, when you purchase a manual, you also then get an upgraded status on our website. Our website has 7 different levels of access. And there's a public level, and then there's a member school level. There is an accredited school level, and a school that purchased the manual is given access at that level. And one of the things that they then have access to is a folder of accreditation resources. It's not publicly available, but when they purchase a manual, then that status change is made on our website. And in that folder of accreditation resources, there are 4 recorded webinars about what you do with various parts to prepare for accreditation. Every summer for the last several years, I've done a one-day online training called Preparing a School or Guiding a School Through an Accreditation Process. It's a 5-hour training, and it gives pretty good, thorough information for a school leader that says, hey, I'm interested in accreditation, but I don't know what to do. That training is recorded every summer, and then it's posted to our website. It's in the accreditation resources folder. So when you purchase a manual, then you've got access to that. There's that 5-hour training. There are 3 shorter 1-hour trainings that provide information or an overview. And then there are multiple documents. Our process is divided into 12 standards, and under each standard, there are some resources that are provided about how you might, a sample of a document that you need, or a sample of a manual that you might need. So to get started in our process, purchase a manual and then start watching the webinars about how you prepare.
That's excellent. Great information here. I very much appreciate the work that you've done on behalf of the Golden State Association of Christian Schools. And I'm just very thankful that you've been at the table during this whole process. You've been the expert along this way, and I have been learning so much. And so I want to thank you. Schools, if you have any follow-up questions, further questions that you would like to ask either myself or Dr. Walton, contact me, and I will try to connect us all so that you can pursue this great endeavor that I think would be so effective in improving your school. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. We appreciate the partnership that AACS has with GSACS, and really believe that accreditation can be a tool for school improvement. An interesting data point on that, in the 14 years that I've worked with AACS, we've tracked the enrollment in our accredited schools. And with the exception of the COVID year, where there was a really slight dip, there's never been a decrease in overall enrollment for our accredited schools. Wow. And that's not because they get a certificate to hang on the wall.
Right.
It's because they're schools that are constantly engaging in a process of becoming a better school. And so we really encourage that for your member schools.
Well, thank you. This is great.